Hi, everyone. Hoping that you all are well. Thank you for joining us for this discussion. We're going to be looking at the topic of this entity known as Enoch. Now, Enoch has his own book, and many of you have perhaps read the book or looked at the book or heard of the book or been encouraged to read the book. And many people believe that this book of Enoch is a part of Scripture. Enoch is a very odd book. It doesn't hang together with the rest of the Scripture. There are a few books in Scripture that don't hang together, but Enoch definitely does not hang together. It's sort of similar in some ways in terms of the wording to Job, and there are some dynamics in there that are related to some of those prophetic books, in particular the book of Revelation. But Enoch, just as it stands, again, is a very odd piece of literature, and it's considered a part of the Apocrypha. And so there are some questions about the legitimacy of it and when it came along and all of that. But one thing that is not typically addressed with respect to Enoch is the name Enoch and what Enoch is supposed to mean. Now, we're going to look at these two lines, this Seth line and this Cain line, and you will notice that there are names that are shared on the Cain line and the Seth line. Now, mind you, according to the narrative, everyone that is in existence now is allegedly coming from the Seth line. However, the similarity with respect to the names is very odd. And then there are some dynamics wherein Cain and Abel are conflated. And then there is this conflation with Seth or Set and Cain. And so it's all very confusing in many ways, but we're going to look at a number of these entities and try to do some deconstruction of them to get a better understanding of the essence of these characters. And so we're going to be looking specifically at Cain. So we're starting off with Enoch, but we're going to go back up and address Cain. We're going to again address some of these entities in the Seth line. So we're going to start off here with Enoch. And again, there are a number of questions related to Enoch, but we're going to just look at some of the essence of Enoch so that we can get a better handle on who this Enoch is supposed to represent. Now, if you are not familiar with the book of Enoch, the book of Enoch also includes this listing of these fallen ones. Now, the names of these fallen ones, they are decidedly Eastern names. And so they sound like Hebrew, Arabic sorts of names. These are these purported fallen angels in this narrative. And so, one of the things to make note of with respect to Enoch is that Enoch is heavily associated with mystery systems and magic in a way that's very similar to Solomon. And so, with respect to Enoch, there are these magic systems associated with Enoch, these Enochian systems. And then there's also, according to some narratives, an Enochian language. And so, as already indicated, there are names that are shared under the Cain line and the Seth line. And so there are arrows here directing you to these relationships. And so in some instances, the names are identical. However, in some instances, the names are similar. Or in terms of etymology, the names have the same root with these two brothers. Now, of course, Cain is supposed to be the firstborn brother, and then Seth being the thirdborn brother, according to the information that we have. And so what's noted is that these similarities exist with respect to these two brothers. And of course, according to the Cain narrative, Cain is sort of written out of history in the narrative. And so he sort of disappears. However, the sons of Cain, their names continue on with these Seth narratives. And it's not completely clear that these are not simply the sons of Cain. When you look at a number of dynamics that are going on in the world, and when we do the deconstruction of Cain, you will see that there is apparently some sort of residue of Cain that is still in existence according to these narratives. And so one of the names that stands out is this Enoch. Now, Enoch is supposed to be the first son of Cain. And then if you look over, there's a name that's very similar under Seth, but this time it's a different kind of Enoch. And this is sort of looks like ENOCH. But if you look down further, you see eventually another Enoch pops up, and that's under the Seth line. And so, regardless of whether you're talking about Cain or you're talking about Seth, people, according to these narratives, are all descended from Cain and Seth by way of Enoch, or one of these Enochs, either of these Enochs. And so it's an interesting narrative in terms of this lineage. And then there are a number of other names that we are going to look at and the narratives related to those entities. Now, if you don't recall the Cain narrative, according to the narrative, Cain is the firstborn child of Adam, and Eve, Havah. And Cain had another brother named Abel. Now, it's really interesting when you look at some of the translations and transliterations of Cain and Abel, they are not the same names. And so it might not jump out at you that you are even talking about the same people, depending on what language you are looking at. But according to the narrative, there was a deity that was receiving a sacrifice. One sacrifice from Cain, one sacrifice from Abel. One was a child who tended the flocks, and the other was one who tilled the ground. Now, Cain has an interesting relationship in terms of the name and the etymology. It has an interesting relationship with Eve. And so there are some dynamics related to the Cain name and narrative and the curse that was put on Eve. And so it's a very interesting thing, and we will look at that, but we're going to focus on Enoch here. But with respect to Cain and Abel, Cain offered a sacrifice that was not accepted, basically produce, vegetables, his first fruits. And you've probably heard that before, first fruit. So he offers first fruit. According to the narrative, this first fruit may or may not have been accepted. It's not clear because when you look in the Hebrew, it doesn't go along with what's stated in the English. So it's not completely clear what happened with this whole Cain and Abel sacrifice dynamic. But according to the English translation, we have Cain becoming envious because Abel's sacrifice was considered acceptable. But again, this is not completely clear when you're looking at the Hebrew, okay? And so according to the narrative, he became so envious or so jealous of Abel being accepted and his sacrifice being accepted that he took Abel or accompanied Abel to the land and then destroyed Abel. And then when confronted about it, offered the question of whether he was his brother's keeper. And have we heard that before? It sounds like some Nino Brown narrative. At any rate, that's the story of Cain and Abel. And then Seth was conceived after this. and considered this replacement. Not only was Seth a replacement for Abel, but ultimately Seth was seen as this replacement for Cain. And so he was standing in for all of these brothers. Now, of course, we've addressed Seth in great detail. Okay, so we've looked at Seth or Set in a very detailed manner. And we see when really deconstructing Seth or Set that Set is not exactly a nice entity. We also see that Cain is not a nice entity according to the narrative. And so what we have left, interestingly, are these narratives about all of the descendants, all of the people on earth today being descended from this Set entity. And so when you look at the deconstruction of Set, you see how problematic that might be. This idea that all of humanity in existence today are from this Set line. This is problematic for many reasons. However, there is also some indication that there's a belief that there are people on earth that are all descended from the Cain line. And there are various narratives that point in this direction. And so ultimately, there's this narrative that in terms of what remains from Adam and from Eve, based upon the deluge, is some sort of remnant of the Cain line and the Seth line. Interesting. Now, what's also noted is that there are these priesthood narratives associated with many of these patriarchs in Scripture and out of Scripture. And so there's a heavy focus on patriarchy. There's a heavy focus on very specific patriarchs. And patriarchs are the father rulers. And so these father ruled lines descending from Adam and Eve. And so there are these priesthoods that are associated with these lines. And Enoch is one of these priesthoods. And so whether you're talking about Cain or whether you're talking about Seth, there is this Enochian priesthood narrative. Now, with respect to Enoch, Enoch is associated with this occultic priesthood. In other words, a hidden, secret sort of priesthood. And so this is one of those enigmas. Now, there are a number of spiritual traditions that appear to hold Enoch in high esteem. Of course, the Hebrews hold Enoch in high esteem, but there are some other entities that hold Enoch in high esteem. What is noted when deconstructing the name Enoch is that Enoch is not just this upright character. The name Enoch, and of course you already know that it's not really pronounced Enoch, so you know there's some other odd pronunciation, and we're going to look at that. But this name Enoch means initiated. That's right. So when looking at this book of Enoch, the actual title is the Book of the Initiated. And so this is a priesthood related to initiation. And so with respect to Enoch, we have this book of Enoch, which is the book of initiation. And if you read the book of Enoch, you see all of the oddities in the book of Enoch, and you can see how it might be related to this idea of mystery systems and initiation. So let's go over to our favorite Strong's Concordance. And what we see in Strong's at H or Hebrew 2585 is Enoch is not exactly spelled or pronounced the way we would think it would be. And so with respect to this Enoch, we see that it's not Enoch. Instead, what we have here in terms of this lexicon is this Enoch spelled C as in Charlie, Hanok. And this is supposed to be a proper name and it's masculine. Now, when you look at the pronunciation and the transliteration, you see something very interesting. The first thing you see is Cain's name. And so you see this Chanok. And Chanok or Chanok is a Cainish derivative. And so it's not Enoch, it's Chanok. Okay. And if you look down to this word origin, it indicates that the word origin is at 2596. That doesn't really make sense because that means it's coming after this 2585 in terms of etymology. However, this is what is stated here. And so you see that the meaning of Chanok, Enoch, is initiated. Now, when looking at translations and transliterations, a couple of things pop up. One is this idea of initiation or being initiated. Another way of looking at this name in terms of transliteration is dedicated or disciple. So again, you see this sort of mystery, occultic dynamic going on with respect to this name. This name is also associated with this idea of teacher. And so sort of not only initiated, but one who is a master. And so you see sort of this master-student dynamic going on with respect to this name, Enoch. Almost like Star Wars. And so you have the Jedi and the apprentice. And so that's what's going on with respect to this name, Enoch, because this idea of apprentice is also associated with Enoch. Now, one might wonder, what type of initiated are we talking about if someone is the first grandson? And so you have Adam, you have Cain, and you have Enoch. And so what type of initiation are we talking about here? And then along with the Seth line, we have this Enoch. And so according to the narrative, these people were very new to the earth. And so what type of initiation, again, are we talking about here? When you read the book of Enoch, you see there are some very odd dynamics that speak to this idea of initiated, this idea of master, this idea of teacher, this idea of disciple and student. Now we're going to look at some very interesting notations related to Enoch in this particular lexicon that, according to this, was authored by Albert Mackey, MD. And so, of course, the question comes up, is this person related to good old John Mackey? This was apparently authored in 1860. And no doubt all of this is related to the Scots. And of course, there are some questions related to the Scots and Scripture, because the Scots at one point had their hand on Scripture. Just looking at King James, we know that there was significant Scots influence in terms of the Scripture, not just the King James Version, but Scripture, period. And we see the Scots heavily involved, of course, in colonization and imperialism. We see the Scots, of course, heavily involved in trafficking. We see the Scots heavily involved in these mystery systems, including Charles II being involved in this whole cabal situation. And so here we see this notation in this lexicon. about Enoch. And so it indicates here, and this is suggesting that this is related to Seth, but when you look at those lineages, you see that Enoch is the father of this Methuselah, or some derivative of that, in both the Cain line and the Seth line. Okay? All right, so it indicates here of Enoch, the father of Methuselah. The following tradition is interesting. Yes, it is. Okay. It indicates when the increasing wickedness of mankind had caused God to threaten the world with universal destruction, Enoch became afraid that the knowledge of the arts and the sciences would perish with the human race. How much knowledge of arts and sciences did they have at this time that Enoch was so concerned these things would perish with the human race? And so, when looking at the timing of all of this, it's just a very interesting notation. Okay, so Enoch was very concerned that all of this knowledge about all of these arts and all of these sciences would perish with the human race based upon this destruction. And so Enoch wanted to take steps to avoid this catastrophe. And so it was very important, according to this, that these arts and sciences be preserved. This Enoch entry goes on to indicate to avoid this catastrophe and to preserve the principles of the sciences for the posterity of those whom God should be pleased to spare. He, Enoch, assuming it's Enoch here, erected two great pillars on the top of the highest mountain, the one of brick, the other of stone, on which were engraven these sciences, to the end that if the pillar of stone should be destroyed by fire, that of brick might remain. And so, in other words, Enoch, according to this, engraved the information related to the sciences on a pillar of stone, and then engraved the same thing on this pillar of brick, anticipating that if one was destroyed, the other might remain. Oh, and it goes on. And if the pillar of brick should be destroyed by water, that of stone might remain. And so Enoch was really a problem solver here, really anticipating outcomes and preparing for this destruction, whether it was destruction by fire or destruction by water. Enoch, according to the narrative, wanted to make sure that whatever humans remained after this destruction, they would be able to go to the top of this mountain and get the information about these arts and sciences. It goes on to indicate that someone was told by Josephus. You will often note that there are many references to what Josephus had to say. So at any rate, it goes on to say, was to have been seen in his day in the land of Syriad. It's really interesting how all of these things, these dynamics, these people originated in the East. However, many people are in the West obsessed with the East, and this is no exception. It brings up the question of, if the East is so important, why would anyone ever leave it? Going back, according to the Greeks, Enoch was the same as Hermes or Hermes. hmm Um, he taught, say they, the art of building cities. Now, this is interesting because, of course, this is tied to Cain. And so Cain is considered this builder of things. Cain is associated with merchant. Cain is associated with trafficking. Cain is associated with world or global dominion. It goes on to indicate that he, according to the narrative, discovered the knowledge of the zodiac and the course of the planets, made excellent laws, and appointed festivals for sacrificing to the sun. And so, again, Enoch was very busy. And this idea of Enoch being associated with Hermes is just very interesting in and of itself. And so you have this entity that appeared very early on in the narrative doing all of these things and having all of this knowledge. And perhaps this is associated with the knowledge of good and evil that is supposed to have been unlocked or unleashed based upon Eve taking a bite of the fruit and offering this to Adam. Now, what's also interesting about that narrative is in the narrative, it's not clear that she offered anything to Adam. Um, she offered something to someone in the narrative, but it's not completely clear that it's Adam. Now, continuing on here, we see that according to this narrative, Enoch was involved in a number of things. And when you look at this, it starts to make the book of Enoch make sense because you see all of these dynamics involved in this book of Enoch. And again, it's very odd given the history, given the timing of all of this, given when Enoch was conceived and when Enoch was born. There's a question of now, where did all of this science and technology knowledge come from at that time? Because we don't have, in terms of the narratives, we don't have manifestations of all of these technologies and all of the science and these arts when you're looking at the narratives. However, when looking at these individual stories about Enoch in this book of Enoch, we see that there are interesting narratives related to these technologies and these entities involved with these technologies, these arts, and these sciences. And you also see this sort of deification of a number of these entities that are presented as human children. And so Enoch is presented as a human child, this descendant of Adam, whether we're talking about Cain or we're talking about Seth. But then there are aspects of these narratives that are deifying aspects. And so you see this here with respect to how the Greeks understood Enoch. And so Enoch is not just appearing in scripture, not just appearing in this book of Enoch. Enoch is appearing in other narratives in other cultures. And my, with respect to the Scots history, we see some interesting dynamics related to Enoch. And again, this is very similar to some of the interesting dynamics related to Set and some of the interesting dynamics we see related to a number of entities in scripture. So this narrative goes on to indicate that Enoch also instructed. There goes that whole teacher thing. So Enoch being initiated, Enoch serving as a teacher or a moray. And so Enoch is instructing in the worship of the true God. Now, of course, what's interesting here is you don't see the name of this true God. And we're not going to get into this again about the name of this true God according to this particular lexicon background. But you can see we've had discussions about this purported name and perhaps this hidden name that's associated with the tribe of Levi or the Levites or the Louis or the Leo, all of that, okay? And so Enoch was very busy. And so Enoch is a teacher, a preacher, and all sorts of things. It also indicates that he too was the inventor of books and the art of writing. It goes on to indicate, and we're going to wrap it up with this. We're not even going to analyze it any further. I'm going to let you analyze this. So it goes on to indicate, according to our traditions, Enoch was a very eminent Freemason and the conservator of the true name of God, which was subsequently lost even among his favorite people, the Jews. Now, not only do we see these oddities related to Enoch and this name Enoch, this character Enoch, we also see some odd dynamics related to the entities known as Adam, Eve, ENOCH, okay, Seth or Set, Cain in particular, and also we see these odd dynamics related to none other than Noah. So as we wrap this up, I'm just going to leave you with a reiteration. With respect to all of these books and all of these resources that people are using when they are discussing these topics, when someone gives you a book that they are reading or they are referencing, I encourage you to go and look at the book for yourself. And the book of Enoch is definitely one instance of this. It's important for you to see things for yourself and for you to read things for yourself, for you to understand things for yourself. It's not enough for these pastors and preachers or teachers or professors to do that for you. You really need to do it for yourself so that you have your own knowledge, you have your own understanding, and you have your own wisdom. And you might find that the way that one person is interpreting something might not be the way that you would interpret it or understand it, particularly if you're talking about people who are online. Okay, and so with respect to people who are online, it's important for you to go behind all of that knowledge that's presented. And again, make sure that you are seeing the same thing that they are seeing and that you are understanding it the same way that they are understanding it versus another way of understanding it. Because when you look at a number of these dynamics, you will come away with an understanding that varies from the way that a number of these things are presented. And so, again, it's very important for you to study for yourself, because many of these things that we are looking at, these things are serving as the foundation of the existence that we are living in current times. When we look at these foundations, we see the roots of colonialism. We see the roots of imperialism. We see the roots of all of these destruction dynamics that are around the world, that have been transported all around the world. And so it's very important for people to study for themselves so that they have understanding for themselves and that they are not manipulated with all of these narratives that are aimed at all of the people around the world. Understand for you. Don't just take what someone else is saying as the gospel truth. Okay. And even when it comes to the gospel, question that also. If someone tells you not to question it, then you can refer them back to study and show thyself approved.